Of course, everyone's eyes are locked on Donald Trump and Syria. Still, even though we reported on Thursday night as it was happening, or at least as it was reported to us, Donald Trump ordered a strike on the airport from which the alleged chemical attacks took place or were launched. He launched an attack and did not quite destroy the airbase. I did not pull his tweets, but it was interesting that Donald Trump began tweeting out almost a justification as to why the airstrike Tomahawk missiles, which are GPS accurate, like laser targeted accuracy. He began describing why this particular attack was not as effective. But not to get caught up on his drivel, because he's still full of drivel. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, he said that the U.S. airstrikes damaged or destroyed 20% of Syrian aircraft at that base. And he said that it would be ill-advised for Assad to ever again use chemical weapons. He said, this is General Mattis, according to the BBC World News. He said, quote, it was a measured response by the United States that resulted in the damage and destruction of fuel and ammunition sites, air defense capabilities, and 20% of Syria's operational aircraft. He added that the Syrian government has lost the ability to refuel or rearm aircraft at the airfield in which the attack took place. Use of the runway is of idle military interest. Now, it seems to be competing narratives as far as how effective the airstrike was. But there's also competing narratives as to what this airstrike actually means. And what does this mean in terms of Donald Trump's foreign policy? What does this mean in regards to our relationship with Russia? Of course, as we reported last week, actually, no, we did not get a chance to report this last week because it did not come out until after our broadcast. But Russia was notified. Russia was notified of the strike before the strike in order for Russian troops and military personnel to get away from the airport. Now, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not that was an appropriate move. I'm not quite sure why there's any debate about that, to be honest with you, because this was out of everything that was potentially wrong with the attack, I think that was the smartest thing to come out of it. Because the last thing we need to do is to have a surprise attack on Assad that inadvertently gets us into a conflict with Russia. And so a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, I mean a lot of mainstream media voices who are trying to spin the fact that President Trump and the Defense Department notified Russia in advance as some type of continuation of a conspiracy theory, when in fact it was the most responsible and mature thing to come out of all of this weekend's events, was to give Russia the notification necessary to keep us from getting into an armed conflict with Russia. So to that, I have absolutely no problem with it. The question is, what is Donald Trump's foreign policy? And what is Donald Trump's, or rather, what made Donald Trump change his mind with regard to Syria? Now, there's some speculations that it actually could be Ivanka Trump. Ivanka Trump began tweeting about how devastating it was to see the images of the babies, of the chemical attacks. And then it seemed like almost immediately after, she began to vocalize, and this is just one of many theories, but it's worth mentioning because this is not the first time we've seen Ivanka Trump have an outsized influence on the president of the United States. And almost immediately after she began to voice her dissent, strikes were launched. Now, that's just one perspective. The other perspective is that it could quite possibly be the military industrial complex putting pressure on Donald Trump in the way that they would put pressure on any president. Why he did it, I'm not sure that we are ever going to know, at least anytime soon, why he would make a complete 180 from having a non-interventionist perspective to completely intervening. And not only intervening, but also giving a signal that he'd be willing to initiate a regime change war in order to get rid of Assad. Some speculate that actually may be in the works right now. Others say that, according to the language from Jim Mattis, that this is a warning. This was a warning, rather, and that if Assad continues, then they would go in and institute some type of regime change. I'm not sure that we can actually gather an actual foreign policy from Donald Trump on this. except for erratic, unpredictable, and unless there is some concrete piece of evidence that he's privy to, which is possible, but not in Donald Trump's style, unless there's some concrete piece of evidence that he's privy to that demonstrates that this was clearly Assad, no questions, then not only is his foreign policy, I don't want to call it feckless at this point, but it is absolutely unpredictable. But it's also highly influenced by people who probably should not be influencing the president on foreign policy, namely Ivanka Trump and anyone else in his circle. But again, these speculations, that's all we can do is really speculate. Now, what we can do with certainty is take a look at the ramifications, the possibilities of conflict and furthering the conflict and getting the United States involved on a level that we, quite frankly, don't have the resources, energy, or political will to get involved. And somewhat the conversation of the hypocrisy over whether or not this is even about humanitarianism. I'm really one that does not believe that this has anything to do with humanitarianism, even if there's a side effect of humanitarianism. I don't believe this is directly, particularly with Donald Trump, I don't believe it's directly connected to any type of humanitarianism, because if it was, you would not ban the same people that you're bombing. You couldn't. And I get it. You're right. So we're, someone could argue that he's banning them. Yes, but he's also protecting them from getting attacked chemical. If you really want to be a humanitarian, then there are other ways of helping the people of Syria than bombing them. But again, I'm not sure that we can piece together any type of coherent foreign policy from Donald Trump other than it is erratic, other than it is unpredictable. Yeah, I'm really trying to chew on this and see if there's anything more that we can glean from it. I'm going to intentionally avoid the conversation on interventionism, this debate that's going on in progressive circles, whether or not we should intervene, whether or not we should stay away. I'm going to intentionally avoid that just a little bit longer because I want to have a robust conversation just on that topic, because there's a lot of nuances to be argued with it. There's a lot of grandstanding taking place. I will say this. The easiest thing, and I think I just opened up a can of worms. I should have stopped while I was ahead. The easiest thing for us to do is to grandstand when it's an issue of war and peace. The easiest thing to do is for us to look as though, or to try to give the impression that we are somehow morally superior, or however you want to describe it. But to me, the biggest responsibility that we have as progressives is not only to be anti-war, but also to present policies and positions, alternatives that are viable alternatives as foreign policy, so that we're not just shouting about our outrage over interventionism and our outrage over war and conflict. Because if we're not giving a solid alternative, a viable alternative that can compete with the military industrial complex, I'm mighty afraid that all we're doing is grandstanding.